congratulations on finding our new venue. Go straight to the Eagle, as I'm sure you do all the time, and just carry on. Very warm welcome to this McDonald Distinguished Lecture by Joanne Pillsbury from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. Now, before I introduce our speaker a little more fulsomely, I'd like to pose a small conundrum to all of you. And it's quite simply this. What, if anything, is the causal connection between the timing of industrial action and the archaeology of South and Mesoamerica? Because it was during our previous strike that we welcomed our last high-profile visitor of this ilk, Professor Leonardo Lopez Lujan, the excavator of the Great Temple at Tenochtitlan, and his wife, Dr. Laura Filloy Nadal, a no less distinguished expert in Mesoamerican iconography. Those of you who had some time to talk with them may remember how they soon revealed among the many marvels of Aztec culture the fact that they had first met on a demo in Mexico City. And they confessed that by contrast they found our style of protest really rather disappointingly low-key. And I'm not by there, I don't think that I'm necessarily inciting you to up the game in our present performance. But it was very striking. They gave us some hot tips as to how one can have a lot more fun in this kind of pursuit. Now, Dr. Pillsbury is presumably following this strange new ritual of refreshing one's marital vows on the picket line. And she's like I brought her husband and Harvard with her. So it's a huge pleasure to welcome you both to Cambridge. Welcome you back to East Anglia and both to Cambridge. So a very, very warm welcome. I hope you'll both enjoy your stay and have a great time. We're enormously honoured and delighted to have you with us. And after this fabulous lecture, we look forward to many hours of good discussion, conversation, laughter, and general exchange of ideas. Dr. Pillsbury has blazed a starry career through the firmament of pre-Columbian archaeology. She majored in anthropology at Berkeley, so you need look no further for that basic radicalism. She took a PhD from Columbia in art history and archaeology, and then she gravitated to that natural centre of the world, East Anglia, where for a decade she held a lectureship on just up the road, in fact, from here, at the Salisbury Research Unit for the arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. And part of that, I think, was concurrent with a position in the National Gallery of Art back in the US. How you managed that, I don't know, but it was an impressive achievement. And if that wasn't enough, in quick succession, she then rose to become Dumbarton Oaks Professor of Pre-Columbian Studies at the University of Maryland, Director of Studies in the Pre-Columbian Program at Dumbarton Oaks itself at Harvard, and an Associate Director of the Getty Research Institute. All that before being appointed to her present post as the Andron E. Pearson Curator at the Met, in charge, therefore, of one of the most extensive collections of pre-Columbian American art and material culture north or east of the Rio Grande. In fact, probably the largest one, isn't it? Must be that way. Joanne works with some of the most extraordinary traditions of ancient art, architecture, and material culture on the planet. Those extending from the Andes through the Central American neotropics and up to the Mexican highlands. She has made major contributions to our understanding of these creations as images, as symbols, as ideology, aesthetics, and technology. And she's won several prizes not only for her outstandingly innovative and insightful scholarship, but also for her brilliant success at bringing these creations to the wider public through catalogues and a series of very thoughtfully designed blockbuster exhibitions. What we have coming, therefore, is sure to be a feast both for the eyes and for the intellect alike. So without more ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Joanne Pillsbury to speak to us on the Golden Road, this time not that of James Elroy Flecker, the Golden Road to Samarkand, but rather towards a deeper knowledge of materials, value, and exchange in the ancient Americas. Joanne, welcome back. Lovely to see you. Technology in a new venue tries to plunge you not into entire darkness.
Yeah, good. Super. And thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Good evening, everyone. It really is a great pleasure to be here. And I'm particularly grateful to... can you all hear me? Well, yes? Good. I'm particularly happy to be introduced by Cyprian because his landmark work, The Making of the Middle Sea, was very much part of the intellectual seedbed from which this project grew. And I also wanted to thank Liz Diggory, my cherished and admired colleague in American Studies, and also Emma Jarman for all the kind help with this logistics of this talk. I also would like to acknowledge Steve Hooper, whose conversations about materials and meaning and value, lo those many years ago, have stayed with me since then, so thank you. I would also like to offer a special thanks to Norman Hammond. Norman, as most of you know, has made signal contributions to the field of American archaeology. He's published extensively on the development of complex society in the Maya region, and as well as the history of archaeology. And he's also written shorter works about subjects ranging from Alaska to the Andes. In short, he's very broad-minded for a Mayanist. So in the spirit of Norman, my talk this evening is pretty broad-ranging, as I offer some reflections on ancient American ideas about materials, meanings, and value. This research was part of a broader initiative related to the exhibition Golden Kingdoms, Luxury and Legacy in the Ancient Americas, which I initiated when I was still at the Getty, and where it was first shown before coming to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The exhibition aimed to present a new view of luxury arts of the Incas, the Maya, the Aztecs, and the many other civilizations that thrived in the Americas before the arrival of Europeans in the 16th century. So let's start with the first slide. I bet I know what you're thinking. I bet you're thinking, she brought the wrong slides. Actually, these are the right ones, because I wanted to start in the Andes, the place where the exhibition itself began. On the screen is one of the most famous images of South America, a landscape by the Hudson River School painter Frederick Church, in the collections of the Met. The painting, entitled The Heart of the Andes, is some 5 feet high and 10 feet wide, and its debut in New York in 1859 caused a sensation. It is, of course, a spectacular image of the world's longest and one of the geologically youngest mountain ranges in the world, the Andes. But though Church had traveled to South America and produced many sketches on site, it is an invented landscape, a construction, designed to convey certain ideas and trigger certain associations. It's a view of South America created by a painter from the United States with specific interests and intentions. It is, in other words, a view from the north looking south. What I want to do today is to provide a different view, to reverse the direction. The exhibition Golden Kingdoms was about ideas moving from south to north. In the show, we focused on luxury arts in the lands between the two great imperial capitals, Cusco, the seat of the Inca state, and Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, now buried under Mexico City. The exhibition itself follows a golden road. That is, the development and spread of goldworking in the ancient Americas, from its origins in the Peruvian Andes, in the south, to the spectacular developments farther north in Colombia, to Central America, and then, ultimately, into Mesoamerica. Although the spread northward of goldworking provided the exhibition with its trajectory and narrative, this golden road passed through regions where gold was of little interest to the indigenous populations. Indeed, the exhibition was inspired in part by this tension between materials that we now think of having inherent or universal value, such as gold, and those that were prized by the many civilizations that thrived in the Americas before the arrival of Europeans. What materials were considered most precious to the Moche, the Incas, the Maya, the Aztecs, and other ancient American cultures? The Golden Road itself, the earliest gold working in the ancient Americas, begins high in the Andes. While Inca is a name well known to most, the Inca Empire was but the last of many civilizations, many complex polities that arose over the course of several millennia since the arrival of the... They're telling me to install some updates. Sorry about that. Before the arrival of the first inhabitants in the New World some 22,000 years ago. And the Inca Empire was relatively short-lived. Some of the earliest works of art in gold found in the Americas were uncovered at a site in the province of Cajamarca in Peru. This site, known as Kunturwasi, dates to around 1000 BC. Among the great finds of this beautiful hilltop site are works in bone, gold, and shell. On the screen is a nose ornament, sometimes called a mouth mask. For when it was worn, it would have covered most of the lower part of the face. Here we see a snaggle-toothed, snarling feline grasping two human figures shown in profile. Another work from Kunturwasi features snarling felines shown both upside down and right side up. The precise meaning of such works is unclear, because writing as we know it was not practiced in the pre-Columbian Andes. For the Andes, we're dependent on distant and indirect sources, such as accounts written by the Spanish conquistadors, priests, and administrators in the 16th century. Given that these remarkable works were made some 2,000 years before the arrival of the Spaniards, we, as scholars of ancient American art, face many challenges in the interpretation of such objects. We will never know with precision why such great cats were featured, but we can certainly pause to consider their characteristics and to register that we still remain fascinated by them today. This crown, as with the previous work I have shown from Kunturwasi, was recovered from the tomb of a high-status male. In this early period, it seems that mostly the guys got to wear the fancy regalia. Many of the works in the exhibition come from funerary or devotional contexts, and it sharpens and deepens this question of how we, collectively and individually, select certain materials to create the most meaningful objects of our lives. Gold is literally incorruptible. It neither corrodes nor decays, and thus it's capable of lasting through time. At its heart, the exhibition Golden Kingdoms was about the eternal existential dilemma, a dilemma shared by all people at all times. How do you anchor the impermanence of existence in something more enduring? The earliest gold objects in the Andes are all ornaments, found in burials or within temple structures. This early association with gods and kings may have set the stage for a broader understanding of metals in the ancient Americas. For as Heather Lechman first noted, metals were only laterally and secondarily used for tools or for weapons. This, of course, makes sense in the case of gold. On the screen is a delicate nose ornament depicting spiders in a web, made sometime in the 1st centuries AD. And here's a detail of the intertwined, hammered gold wire of the web and the spider made of sheep gold. Gold is a comparatively soft material, malleable material, unsuitable for utilitarian purposes on its own. In later periods, copper, a stronger metal, was exploited and used on its own or in alloys. But even then, metals were used primarily for ritual objects. Metals were generally a minor component of the Andean toolkit and armory. Gold, silver, copper, and their alloys were first and foremost expressions of social status, political power, and religious beliefs. In the ancient Americas, artists and their patrons selected materials for luxury arts that could provoke a strong response, perceptually, sensually, conceptually, and elevate the wearer and the beholder beyond the mundane. As Dorothy Hustler has noted, when metalworking technology is first exploited farther north in Mexico, what they liked about the metal was not so much that it was useful for chisels or whatnot, but rather that they made good bells. The sonorous capabilities of metal were prized, especially in the lands where for centuries, probably millennia, bells were made of bone and thus possessed a limited, if penetrating, sound world. These bells were recently excavated by Leonardo Lopez Lujan at the Templo Mayor in Mexico City. Metalworking technology and ideas moved both overland and through maritime routes from south to north. This rough line of transfer, however, from the Andes to Mesoamerica is dotted with independent inventions along the way, as well as expressions of startling creativity. Thus, we've focused on what we've called crucibles of innovation, specific times and places of exceptional achievements in the arts. And we've been able to do so by doing a deeper dive into specific places, many of which have been the focus of recent and ongoing scientific excavations. From the outset, it was our intention to foreground scientifically excavated works. On the screen are my co-curators, Timothy Potts, the director of the J. Paul Getty Museum, and Kim Richter of the Getty Research Institute in the tomb of Bacal at Palenque. But it was really through collaboration with fellow scholars from across the Americas that we've been able to come to new understandings about luxury arts. This is part of the international group at the Museo del Templo Mayor in Mexico City. Clearly we're arguing over use-ware analysis or something like that. And here especially, I would like to salute Cambridge's own Marcos Martignon Torres, who's one of our catalog authors. So thank you very much, Marcos. The exchange of conservation expertise was also a major part of the project. Here's one of the textile conservation workshops at the Museo Nacional in Lima. I'd like to say that Golden Kingdoms was about the exchange of ideas both in the past and in the present. Because it's through the study and conversation with colleagues, we collectively came to a new understanding about the role of these works in the exchange of ideas across regions. The project allowed us to think about ancient American art in a fresh way, unconstrained by today's national boundaries, and in the process, revealing networks across what were once, and are all too often now, considered separate traditions. One of the most important crucibles of innovation surely must be Peru's north coast in the years between 200 and 800 AD. On the screen is an ear spool from the Moche site of Sipan, famously excavated by Walter Alba. This miniature masterpiece features a nearly three-dimensional warrior, complete with a crescent-shaped headdress and nose ornament, and other regalia that matches the full-size examples interred with the Lord of Sipan himself. The discovery of Sipan 30 years ago ushered in a thrilling new era in archaeology in Peru, and the exhibition celebrated many of these recent finds, including this ceramic vessel from Dos Cabezas on the left. The vessel is in the shape of a seated individual, complete with an octopus frontal on his headdress, similar to the one from the neighboring site of La Mina, seen here on the right. Archaeologists once referred to these 6 centuries of the first millennium AD as the master craftsman period, for the exceptional achievements in the visual arts by peoples of this period, particularly in the metallurgical arts. As with their contemporaries, the classic Maya, the Moche were independent polities dominating different river valleys that cut from the foothills of the Andes down to the coastal plain. And this region is indicated here in red on the left. they were probably never unified into one large state, or at least they weren't for long. It's highly likely that there was a fierce rivalry between these polities, and I'm quite sure that this rivalry, this intense competition among the Moche courts, also played out in the visual arts, spurring artists on to ever greater heights. On the screen is a pair of Moche ear ornaments. Their large shafts would have been inserted through a perforation in the earlobe. The frontals were made of sheet gold with tesserae of blue and green stone, and also spondular shell. This winged figure sporting the head of an owl is a type of ritual runner, his swift movements captured beautifully by the artist, from the vigorous pumping of his arms to his airborne feet that just grace the edges of the ornament. As is already abundantly evident from what I've shown you, Moche artists were accomplished metallurgists, developing a wide range of techniques to achieve desired ends. They pioneered new technologies in alloying and gilding metals, some of which were more sophisticated than those known in Europe at the time. This mask, for example, was likely gilded through a type of electrochemical plating process, a technology that would not be known in Europe for another 1,000 years. The mask's golden appearance was achieved this way, and then sections were painted, so the grayish area is probably paint. At the Met, we've been conducting research to study these technologies, and this last detail, the fact that gold would be painted, never fails to cause my colleagues in Western art to scratch their heads. This Moche also silvered gold, and then you see the microns thin layers of silver that Moche artists applied over part of the objects. Again, Moche applied a layer of silver over the gold. The Moche artists particularly delighted in the play of gold and silver together. On the screen is a nose ornament, and the Moche loved nose ornaments, featuring a canine with a snake-like body and canine-like heads. It must have been a dazzling sight when worn, the small dangles catching the light as the wearer moved. This kinetic quality undoubtedly contributed to a sense of the animate nature of the materials and their associated supernatural powers. But on a very practical level, in performance, this quality would have enhanced the visibility of the wearer. These vibrant works would have been visible from great distances. Now, until recently, scholars have long thought that only high-status men wore nose and ear ornaments. New excavations, however, have revealed that such ornaments were part of women's regalia as well. This is a view of the site at Cabo Viejo, a lovely site right on the edge of the Pacific Ocean, where excavations by Regulo Franco in 2004 revealed the tomb of a high-status female. On the right is Arabel Fernandez, who is currently a fellow with us at the Met. The occupant of the tomb has become known as the Lady Acao, and she was laid to rest with an array of weapons generally associated with men, including spear throwers and war clubs, and I think you can see the war clubs on the right. She died relatively young, and it seems that her funerary regalia was prepared in haste, or at least some of it. But other objects were not, and were prepared over a longer period of time. And these demonstrate great skill. Her nose ornaments are particularly impressive. She went to the great beyond with no fewer than 44 nose ornaments. You can never have too many nose ornaments. And they feature a wonderful array of marine creatures in geometric form. On the left are 2 crayfish, enclosed by another 2-headed creature. And on the right are 2 silver crayfish, back to back, with a crab in the interstices between them. Across the Americas, textiles, and especially featherwork, may have been valued above all. Alas, such delicate works do not survive well in most places. Southern Peru's coastal desert, however, is an exception. On the screen are 9 of what were originally probably 96 panels that were found tightly rolled up in ceramic vessels. These were made in the second half of the first millennium AD by artists of the First Andean Empire, called Wari, which dominated a sizable amount of central and southern Peru. Featherwork was a delicate, imaginative, and mind-bogglingly complicated art. The feathers are from the blue and yellow macaw, which had to be imported from the Amazon rainforest. Created by knotting individual feathers to strings, the strings were then thickly layered to create exceptionally plush, luxurious panels. Here's a detail of one of those panels. But to appreciate them fully, you really need to get close and experience the iridescence, the radiant, shifting color of the plumes. This final detail gives you a sense of the plushness achieved by layering the feathers. The wall that I showed you probably has some 250,000 individual feathers. I'm sure many of you are thinking, what happened to the birds? I'm sure many of you are thinking what happened to the birds, but that's the topic for another lecture. But we should consider the time, the care, and the materials that were dedicated to their production, attributes that made them literally more prized than gold. But let's return to our central question. How do we understand beliefs about materials? I became interested in differing regimes of value through my own work at the site called Chan Chan on Peru's north coast. This city thrived in the centuries before the rise of the Inca Empire, or roughly AD 1000 to 1470. In its day, it was a city famed for its metalsmiths and other artists. Indeed, perhaps as much as a third of the city's inhabitants were engaged with craft production. On the screen is an aerial view of one of the palaces and a number of the tall goblets that are among the handful of works that escaped being melted down in the 16th century. Now, these vessels are exquisite, but were these noble metals what the Chimú themselves would have considered most valuable? Several accounts from the early colonial period suggest otherwise. According to the royal cosmographer Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa, when the Inca conquered the Chimú, they acquired innumerable riches of gold and silver and other precious things, such as precious stones and red shells, which these natives then esteemed more than silver or gold. A red shell, really? It's a salutary reminder that we should not impose our regimes of value on theirs. The red shell in question is spondylus, a spiky bivalve known as the thorny oyster. Spondylus served a number of ritual purposes and was used to create spectacular ornaments, such as this beautiful Chimú pectoral made up of thousands of tiny shell beads. The Inca called spondylus shells the daughters of the sea, the mother of all waters. Clearly associated with water, abundance, and fertility, spondylus has been found as offerings in burials, in wells, and in agricultural fields. On the screen is a ceramic ritual vessel with depictions of the bivalve on its deck. Liquids could be poured into the top and exit through a spout on the side. But we must ask ourselves the question, of all the materials they could choose, why thorny oysters? Surely not because they were good to eat. Indeed, the thorny oyster is a risky proposition as a foodstuff, at least for mortals. Gods, however, could eat them. In the ancient Americas, for sumptuary arts, artists and their patrons selected materials that were closely associated with the supernatural. These materials, gold, feathers, shell, were thought to be embodiments of divine power. These are materials that were emitted, inhabited, or consumed by gods. And this brings me to an important point about the role of these luxury arts in the ancient Americas. In our world, we tend to think of luxury arts as superfluous things, anything beyond the necessary. But this simple distinction obscures the importance of cultural beliefs. Certain objects, while not considered essential for practical purposes according to our own beliefs, were nonetheless social and spiritual necessities in particular times and places. These works were considered efficacious active agents essential for the maintenance of the social order and the bestowal of divine blessings. In this way, earlier European understandings of luxury may be closer to the pre-Columbian sense of the concept. In Europe in the 17th and 18th century, luxury was defined in terms of social and political ideas of right and title. It was about what was appropriate for whom. In the end, Chanchan's great wealth and the fame of its metalsmiths proved to be its undoing. This city was a rich target for the Incas in the late 15th century. According to Pedro Cieza de Leon, a 16th century Spanish chronicler, when the Inca conquered Chanchan, they kidnapped the metalsmiths and pressed them into service high in their capital, Cusco. Such practices are a reminder that skilled creators were highly sought after by political leaders, so much so that these artisans became coveted spoils of war in themselves. And the Inca needed these true metalsmiths. They went from 0 to 60 in no time and conquered most of Western South America in a lightning fast 150 years or so. The Inca Empire is represented here in red. The Inca really didn't have time to develop certain courtly arts. They were too busy beating up on their neighbors and reorganizing them along their own cultural lines. But they did excel in textiles. Building on the achievements of their predecessors, they created some of the finest tapestry cloth ever made. One of the more well-known forms is a checkerboard tunic of the type worn by the 1st Regiment of the Inca ruler's army. Indeed, the first Spanish account of the Inca ruler's entourage in Cajamarca, Peru, describes their strikingly bold livery in the form of a chessboard. Probably given as royal gifts to warriors who distinguished themselves on the battlefield, such tapestry garments were likely the most highly valued material to the Inca. Cloth could be more precious than gold. Indeed, even the Inca royal crown was made not of gold, but of a red wool fringe. Such variations in material preferences brings to the fore the most challenging and broad-ranging question driving this project. How can we discern and interpret indigenous ideas of value? How and why were certain materials selected and transformed into some of the ancient world's most spectacular works of art? Variations in the regimes of value come into focus as we moved farther north in the exhibition, particularly as we entered into the forests of jade, the region known as Mesoamerica. Here, gold held little allure. Jade was the ancient and enduring luxury material par excellence for the Olmecs and the Maya, and it was a rare material. The only source of jade in the Americas is Guatemala's Motagua River Valley. Such a highly valued material was worth transporting over great distances, however, even as far south as what is now Costa Rica. Indeed, for me, the area that is now Costa Rica is one of the most fascinating areas to consider in light of our question about regimes of value. On this screen is a type of ornament known as winged pendants. They're first made in jade. Closely associated with maize or corn, jade's rich blue-green color was a potent symbol of power and fertility. After about 800 AD, however, winged pendants are made in gold. Why? Are they suddenly cut off from the jade sources with the collapse of the Maya city-states that happens around the same time? Or do they decide that gold is just actually much easier to deal with than jade? Jade is one of the hardest materials to carve. Or is there another reason? A wonderful detail here on these gold-winged pendants is that on two of them, the bulbous eyes are actually bells, complete with clappers. Is gold selected for its capacity to create a ringing sound? Jade too can create a lovely, albeit distinct sound. In the classic Maya period, rulers would wear sets of jade celts at their waists, which would create a delicate pinging sound as they hit against each other. Here we see an exquisite figurine of a dignitary wearing such ornaments. And then on the right, a jade celt that was incised with a portrait of a ruler wearing such celts. In contrast with their predecessors, the Olmecs, the Maya royals were dripping with jade. The Olmecs, the first in the Americas to use jade, wore it sparingly. The Olmecs considered jade a sacred material from the earth that more often than not was worked and then ritually returned to the earth as a deposit, as an offering. The Maya, their successors, took this sacred material and deployed it as part of their royal regalia. And they go to town with it. One can hardly make out the person behind the regalia in this spectacular portrait of a Maya queen. She wears a garment of jade beads, a jade collar, jade jewels in her headdress, along with brilliant green quetzal feathers, and she holds a ceremonial bar from which a serpent springs forth. She's enveloped in sacred materials as she communes with otherworldly powers. In the exhibition, we were fortunate to bring together royal regalia and royal portraits of a Maya dynasty from the site of Palenque in Chiapas, Mexico. On the screen is one of the masterpieces of Maya relief carvings. Here we see the ruler Pakal in a posthumous portrait seated between his two grandsons, who are in turn flanked by two jaguar figures, the outer figures. And those are figures that we still don't entirely understand. Pakal himself wears a large jade bar pendant and a jade ornament on his forehead. Such headdress jewels could be quite elaborate, such as the one we see on the right. Worn perpendicular to the forehead, they often feature a being known as the jester god. These jade plaques were the Maya crown jewels. And thanks to recent excavations, that we know that royal women wore them as well. The one on the right here was worn by a queen at the site of El Peru Huaca in what is now Guatemala. One of the great advantages of working with these new finds is that we now know a lot more about women of power in the ancient Americas. Pakal's wife, Lady Zappu Ahau, was laid to rest in AD 672 in a stone sarcophagus covered by a thick layer of cinnabar, dubbed the Red Queen. This is her malachite funerary mask. Now, the Maya region was home to a sophisticated writing system, which is how we know a fair bit about these ornaments, where they were made, and very occasionally, who made them. This object here is an exquisite belt ornament that was likely carved at the site of Piedras Negras in the forests of the Petén in what is now Guatemala. It's actually the only signed work of art in the show. And this is the back side where you see the inscription. The jade belt ornament was later deposited as an offering at the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza on the Yucatan Peninsula. A cenote is a large sinkhole that fills with water. The Maya considered cenotes to be openings to the underworld. They were the bony jaws of the great centipede. One of the offerings in the cenote was a massive jade bar pendant inscribed with a portrait of Pakal's son. Did he himself travel from Palenque to Chichen Itza to make this sacred offering? We do know that many of the works found in the cenote had been made hundreds, if not thousands, of miles away. These delicate gold bells, for example, intentionally smashed before they were offered to the cenote. These were made in Panama. These works that moved around are among the most fascinating ones in the exhibition. The show included a number of objects that began their lives in one part of the ancient Americas, only to be transported in ancient times to locations that are sometimes separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years from where they were first created. Luxury arts, as traditionally defined, are not only of high value, they are also often relatively small in scale and light in weight, qualities that make them worth transporting over great distances as royal gifts, trade items, or devotional offerings. This beautiful jade in the shape of a clamshell with an enigmatic image of an elegant hand grasping a half feline, half insect-like creature was likely carved by an Olmec artist in the Gulf Coast region of Mexico in the first millennium BC. But it ended up in a tomb perhaps as much as 1,000 years later in what is now Costa Rica, more than 1,000 miles away. Luxury arts may be small in scale, but they often carried outsized influence. They were one of the primary means by which ideas were exchanged across regions and through time. And one of the great exchanges of ideas, of course, was metalworking. As Hostler has noted, copperworking technology moved north from South and Central America into Western Mexico around AD 650, and goldworking somewhat later, probably around AD 1000. So it moved slowly. But in this part of the Americas, in Mexico, gold never really usurped jade or feathers as the most treasured material. Indeed, we know that feather workers held a higher status than gold workers in central Mexico. And the quantities of gold production were never large. The archaeologist Leonardo Lopez Lujan has pointed out that even after decades of careful excavation at the Aztec Templo Mayor, in what's now Mexico City, the amount of gold that could be found there could be held in 2 hands. On the screen are some of the recent tiny, tiny finds from the site. The quantities of gold at the Great Temple were dwarfed by the tons of jade at this, the most sacred of Aztec places. But when the metalsmiths of southern and central Mexico did make works in gold, they were remarkable things. This labret, or lid plug, was superbly cast in the form of a serpent ready to strike. Labrets are a type of plug that would have been inserted through a piercing in the lower lip. The gently curved gold flange would have rested against the lower gum. Surely such labrets were not worn to breakfast. They were rather ceremonial or battle attire donned on a specific occasion. Now we, in the 21st century, we may see lip jewelry as purely decorative or perhaps a bit rebellious. But to the Aztecs, it was deeply symbolic. The Aztec term for the royal office was Huetlactuani, or great speaker. And the adornment of the mouth thus captured the locus of power. Labrets were the visual markers of the eloquent, truthful speech expected of royalty and the nobility. Crafted from what the Aztecs considered a sacred material, a labret such as this would have underscored the ruler's divinely sanctioned authority. And this labret in particular is a particularly spectacular one. Let's see if we can make this work. It has an articulated tongue that would move when the wearer moved. But such works are exceedingly rare. Most were melted down in the 16th century. The conquistadors' pillaging was legally sanctioned as long as the royal fifth, the 20% of the booty owed the Spanish king, was paid. Among the very last works in the exhibition were small gold ornaments from Mexico known as the fisherman's treasure. This Mixtec shield pendant, looted by the conquistadors, was stamped with the letter C surmounted by a crown. already been marked as part of the royal fifth, and it was on its way to the Spanish king when the ship sank, only to be recovered by an octopus fisherman in the 1970s off the coast of Veracruz. Most works of pre-Columbian gold ended up like this, melted down into a gold bar or bullion. This particular bar, excavated in Mexico City, likely came from what is known as the Noche Triste, the night when the Spanish conquistadors were driven out of the Aztec capital in 1520. And this brings me to my final point. Luxury arts, especially metals, are among the rarest and most vulnerable art forms. Stones and ceramics are hard to destroy, but the materials of luxury arts are quickly repurposed in the service of new gods and new kings. Metals, in particular, are the most mutable of materials. Works of art in gold and silver were easily melted down and transformed into ingots for ease of transport and trade. The thirst for precious metals in the Americas was ultimately the accelerant to the massive destruction of indigenous communities in the 16th century and beyond. The Spaniards' quest for gold eventually led to a devastating loss of Native American life, as disease and grueling conditions in the mines took their toll on the native populations. Moreover, the European desire for gold and silver was combined with a genuine concern over the power of idolatry. Campaigns were mounted to destroy any vestiges of indigenous religious practices. Incalculable numbers of objects were rooted out and destroyed or buried in the 16th and 17th century. On the screen is an exceedingly rare secular portrait from 16th century South America, a portrait of Don Francisco de Arobe and his two sons by the artist Andres Sanchez Galque. Arobe was the son of an enslaved African who escaped a Spanish galleon and married an indigenous woman from what is now Nicaragua. And they went on to set up an independent kingdom on the coast of Ecuador. In this 1599 portrait, Don Francisco and his sons wear pre-Columbian style gold ornaments, fine silks from Spain and China, and they carry staves in the manner of traditional symbols of power and leadership in Africa. It's a remarkable statement of a newly globalized world. This powerful portrait, along with the other works in the exhibition, remind us of the complexities of history, and they underscore the importance of archaeology and of art history as antidotes to standard textual histories. For what we know from these works is distinct from what we know from historical sources. We know more about populations that are under-addressed in the written texts, such as women and populations in the provinces. These objects can tell us about people who are often excluded from official histories. By and large, most pre-Columbian traditions of gold working, jade working, and other indigenous arts came to an end in the 16th century, or they were significantly transformed in the course of the colonial experience. But aspects of these great pre-Columbian traditions survive in some unexpected ways. Featherworking, which we saw so memorably in ancient Peru, also thrived in Mexico, and the tradition continued on into the colonial period, particularly in sacred contexts such as the church. On the screen is one of the earliest works of Christian art from the Americas. It is called feather painting. It's a composition on wood constructed almost entirely of feathers. Feathers, a sacred material in pre-Columbian times, were perhaps, surprisingly to us, used for votive works in the Catholic Church in Mexico. The feathers of birds were thought appropriate to convey transcendent subjects. The subject matter here is from a Flemish print. It's the Mass of St. Gregory, the story of a 6th century pope and the idea of the Christian sacrament of communion. It was created in 1539 commissioned by Mexico City's governor, Don Diego Huartzin, a descendant of Moctezuma, and the friar Pedro de Gante. It celebrated Pope Paul III's 1537 declaration that the members of the indigenous population were indeed rational human beings. In the 21st century, this seems to us to be a shocking concept. Was the humanity of the indigenous population ever in question? In the 16th century, it was. Europeans had no basis for understanding these complex civilizations of the Americas. At the time, European education was based on the Bible and the classical authors. But the Aztecs don't appear in the Bible, and the Incas don't appear in Pliny. How do you come to terms with understanding these beings and their place in the world? In his deliberations, the Pope took into consideration the delicate featherworks that had been sent to him as gifts. Based in part on the artistry and sophistication of these works, the Pope decided that indigenous Americans were indeed rational human beings. The Pope's declaration meant several things. One, it meant that the indigenous population could own land. Two, it meant that they could receive the sacraments. And three, perhaps most importantly, it meant that they could not be enslaved. It's a moving work on many levels, and it's a work that rewards close looking. Here's a close-up of some of the bird is called lovely cotinga. It's the bird, close-up of the lovely cotinga feathers. But the painting also incorporates roseate spoonbill and even hummingbird feathers. This is the detail of the inscription. The inscription itself is made of feathers, rare, beautiful, sacred materials that draw us in and transport us to another place. The works we've seen here this evening are exceedingly rare testaments to the brilliance of ancient American royal courts and their artists. These precious objects, these deeply resonant works, provide us with tangible connections to these great traditions of ancient Latin America. But they also provide us with opportunities to reflect on our lives today and the way we ourselves accord value to certain materials and how these materials express ideas. The objects in Golden Kingdoms, before they are anything else, are salutary reminders of our human desire to create anchors embodying belief, values, and permanence in an existence we know to be evanescent. Thank you.
Joanne, thank you so much. That was so wonderful. I feel like I have been now been at the exhibit. I just wanted to congratulate you on giving us such a rich tour of the Americas. I try to teach these subjects myself, and I think to bring all of those different cultures together and to knit it into a seamless whole was really an extraordinary achievement. And I love the idea of looking from south to north. I think too often we have our southward gaze, and that was a wonderful way to frame the lecture. I love the way that you were thinking about the different sensory qualities of the objects and the sounds, the questions of audience and visibility, and the idea of people wearing so many of these ornaments. It's just extraordinary. It gives us a sense of very rich life. And I think a life that's very hard for us to imagine from where we sit, but you gave us a very kind of full experience of what that might be. And then just looking at the different materials, the jade, and obviously the gold, but then feathers. Feathers are extraordinary, and seeing those panels gives you a real sense of the richness of those textures, and you realize how differently materials would have been valued and how they would have been seen by other people. And just lastly, I really appreciated the way you explored some of the new ontologies and the ways that people may have perceived objects, and certainly the landscape as animate. But it gives us a new way of thinking about what these things would have meant to people who encountered them. So there's probably much more that we can do, but I think you've given us a great, a wonderful panorama of the Americas, and it's been a real pleasure. So thank you.